Two statements came out of Washington within 72 hours of each other about the exact same strike. They cannot both be fully true. The first came from President Trump in a televised address the night of the operation. Iran's nuclear enrichment sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan had been, in his words, completely and totally obliterated. The second came a few days later when CNN reported on a leaked preliminary assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency based on early battle damage analysis from U.S. Central Command, concluding that the strikes had likely set Iran's program back by maybe a few months tops, and that a significant portion of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile may have already been moved out of the sites before the bombs ever landed. The White House called the leak wrong and the leaker a low-level loser. Israel's Atomic Energy Commission backed the obliterated version, saying the strikes had rendered Fordo inoperable and destroyed its critical infrastructure. European intelligence sources, cited separately by UK media, leaned the other way, suggesting Iran's uranium stocks were largely intact. That fight over the truth, not the strike itself, but what the strike actually accomplished, is still not fully settled more than a year later, and it's the part of this story that gets flattened out in a lot of the retelling. So let's build this properly from the ground up, because the strike itself really was extraordinary. The disagreement about its results is just as important to understand. Why Iran went underground. Go back to the early 2000s. Iranian military planners watched American air power dismantle Iraq's air defenses and harden military infrastructure with a level of precision that had no real historical precedent, and they drew an obvious lesson. Nothing built on the surface, however reinforced, was safe from a determined American strike campaign. So Iran made a strategic bet that would define its nuclear program for the next 2 decades, go deep enough underground that conventional weapons simply couldn't reach. Construction on the Fordo fuel enrichment plant began around 2006, tunneled into a mountain near Qom, roughly 90 kilometers southwest of Tehran. When Western intelligence services confirmed the facility's existence in 2009, it set off real alarm, because Iran hadn't just buried a building. Reporting has put the site somewhere between roughly 45 and 90 meters beneath solid bedrock, depending on the source, layered with reinforced concrete, and equipped with independent emergency power specifically so that a strike on Iran's above-ground electrical grid couldn't shut the facility down. For years, the working assumption in both Washington and Jerusalem was that Israel, in particular, simply did not have a weapon in its arsenal capable of reaching it. Israeli strike planning against Fordo was built around degrading access tunnels and support infrastructure. Real damage, but not the kind that reaches centrifuge halls buried that deep. The United States had a different tool in development, and its entire reason for existing traces back to this exact target: the weapon built for one job. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator started as a program in the mid-2000s, developed by Boeing under contract to the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, reaching operational capability by 2011 and undergoing further refinement afterward. According to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the urgency behind its development was explicitly tied to intelligence from 2009 and 2010 about Iran's underground enrichment facility. This weapon was built with Fordo specifically in mind over roughly 15 years of engineering work. The numbers are worth stating plainly rather than dramatizing, because they're dramatic enough on their own. The GBU-57 weighs approximately 30,000 pounds, measures about 20 feet long, and roughly 2.5 feet in diameter, and carries a high explosive warhead reported at around 5,300 to 5,700 pounds, meaning the overwhelming majority of the weapon's mass is the hardened penetrator casing itself, built to survive the physical punishment of driving through rock and concrete before detonating. It's GPS-guided, meaning it isn't simply dropped in a target's general direction, it's steered to a specific aim point with meter-level accuracy. The fuse has to survive violent deceleration on impact, and then time detonation precisely enough to go off inside the target structure rather than before or after passing through it, which was one of the harder engineering problems the program had to solve. Reported penetration figures vary depending on the source and the composition of what it's punching through. Different outlets have cited depths ranging from roughly 20 to 60 meters through earth, and considerably less through solid reinforced concrete. And official figures on exact performance against a target like Fordo remain, for understandable operational security reasons, not fully public. What is confirmed is that only one aircraft in the American inventory can carry it, the B-2 Spirit, Operation Midnight Hammer, midnight. On the night of June 21st into June 22nd, 2025, 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri as part of a mission publicly named Operation Midnight Hammer, supported by more than 125 additional aircraft, including fighter escorts and aerial refueling tankers, alongside a submarine that fired Tomahawk cruise missiles at the Isfahan facility. The B-2s flew a mission profile that reportedly required multiple aerial refuelings over a round trip lasting somewhere in the range of 36 hours, penetrating Iranian airspace and releasing a combined total of 14 GBU-57 penetrators, 12 aimed at Fordo, two at the Natanz enrichment complex before returning home. It was the first combat use of the weapon since its development began nearly 2 decades earlier. Whatever else is disputed about the outcome, the scale and difficulty of the mission itself isn't seriously in question. A 2-person B-2 crew flying that long over defended territory, delivering a weapon that had never been used in combat, is a genuinely significant military achievement independent of how the political fight over the results played out afterward. Then the disagreement started. This is where the story gets more interesting than the triumphant version, because the fight over what the strikes actually accomplished became almost as significant as the strikes themselves. International Atomic Energy Agency Director General Rafael Grossi offered one of the more measured assessments in the days afterward. Natanz's above-ground facility had been completely destroyed, he said, while its underground halls suffered serious damage from power cuts caused by earlier Israeli strikes. Isfahan had also taken very significant damage in his account. Fordo, because of its independent emergency power, wouldn't have lost function from a grid cut the way Natanz did, meaning any damage there had to come from the strikes directly. Then came the leak. The preliminary DIA assessment, based on early Central Command battle damage analysis, reportedly found that the strikes had largely damaged above-ground structures and power infrastructure at all 3 sites, while centrifuges and the enriched uranium stockpile were not confirmed destroyed, with one source describing the centrifuges as largely intact, and another suggesting the enriched material had already been relocated before the bombs fell. The takeaway line attributed to that assessment was blunt. The U.S. had probably bought itself a few months, not a permanent solution. The White House response was immediate and forceful, calling the assessment flatly wrong and questioning the credibility of whoever leaked it. Israel's Atomic Energy Agency publicly took the opposite position, describing Fordo as rendered inoperable, with its critical infrastructure destroyed. European intelligence sources, according to reporting a few days later, leaned toward the view that Iran's uranium stocks were largely intact, closer to the leaked DIA read than to the obliterated framing. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for his part, said the U.S. believed a significant portion of Iran's 60% enriched uranium stockpile had actually still been at Isfahan when the strikes hit, and called on Iran to dig it out and hand it over for international downblending. A public acknowledgement, in effect, that the location and condition of that material was still an open question. Days after the operation, the administration had called a total success. The uranium that nobody can currently verify. That question hasn't gone away in the time since. Independent nuclear security analysts tracking the situation months later, through the fall of 2025, reported that the fate of Iran's roughly 400-plus kilograms of 60% enriched uranium remained unconfirmed, because Iran has refused to allow IAEA inspectors to verify the stockpile directly. Grossi noted in late October that inspectors had observed movement around the sites where the material is believed to be stored, but by mid-November, the agency's working assessment was that the stockpile hadn't been moved away from the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan sites entirely. While allowing that, it could well have been shifted within those sites, which is a meaningfully different and much less reassuring possibility. That's the honest state of play, carried forward. A weapon that performed exactly as designed, against a target it was purpose-built for 15 years in advance, delivered by crews executing an extraordinarily demanding mission, and a strategic outcome that, more than a year on, still can't be described with full confidence, because the single most important variable, the actual location and condition of Iran's most sensitive nuclear material, remains something international inspectors have not been allowed to verify. The 12 days before the bomb, none of this happened in isolation, and it's worth backing up to place Operation Midnight Hammer in its actual sequence, because a lot of retellings skip straight to the B-2s and miss the run-up. The strikes on Fordow came at the tail end of what's since been referred to as the 12-Day War, which began on June 13, 2025, when Israel launched a surprise wave of strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, hitting significant portions of the Natanz centrifuge halls, its power systems, and supporting buildings, along with a campaign against Iranian air defenses and senior military and scientific personnel. Iran responded with ballistic missile barrages against Israeli cities over the following days. Israel struck Fordo itself on June 13th, and again on June 16th, according to Iranian reporting, though those earlier strikes were understood at the time to be limited to surface-level damage rather than a serious attempt at the underground halls themselves. That's the context in which Operation Midnight Hammer landed. Not a bolt from a clear sky, but the culmination of an escalating, days-long exchange in which Israel had already established a significant degree of control over Iranian airspace, and had been explicit that reaching Fordo's underground enrichment halls required a weapon only the United States possessed. The American strike was, in that sense, the missing piece Israel had been waiting on, rather than a unilateral American decision made from nothing. what this actually changes and what it doesn't. It's tempting to draw a sweeping lesson from all this, that no buried facility anywhere is safe anymore, that every government with underground military infrastructure just watched its core assumption fail in real time. That's a genuinely live conversation among defense analysts, and it's not unreasonable to think capitals watching this closely are recalculating what depth actually buys them, but it's worth being precise about what was actually demonstrated versus what's being inferred. What was demonstrated, a specific weapon, built for a specific facility, delivered successfully by a specific stealth platform, causing serious and confirmed damage to above-ground infrastructure and, per some assessments, to portions of the underground facility itself. What remains genuinely unresolved, whether the material and equipment that make a nuclear weapons program dangerous, enriched uranium, functioning centrifuges, were actually destroyed, relocated or preserved in ways that let the program resume faster than a permanently ended framing would suggest. Those are two different claims, and conflating them is exactly how a real, historic military achievement gets oversold into something more definitive than the available evidence actually supports. Where things stand now. As of this writing, the honest answer is still unresolved and contested by design. Iran has an obvious interest in not letting outside inspectors confirm what survived, since ambiguity itself functions as a form of leverage. The US and Israeli governments have an obvious interest in the operation being remembered as a clean, permanent success. Independent nuclear monitoring organizations, working from the outside with incomplete access, have been the most consistent voice saying plainly that key facts are still not verified, not because they're being evasive, but because that's genuinely where the evidence sits. That's not a satisfying place to end a story about the most powerful conventional bomb ever used in combat, but it's the accurate one. The mission happened, the weapon worked. What it actually bought, in terms of years or months, and what's still sitting in a bunker somewhere near Qom or Isfahan, waiting to be accounted for, that part of the story is still being written by inspectors who haven't yet been allowed to check. This script draws on public reporting from CNN, Reuters, the Atlantic Council, the Institute for Science and International Security, Air and Space Forces magazine, Defense Scoop, and IAEA statements from Director General Rafael Grossi, current as of July 2026. Given the classified nature of much of the underlying battle damage assessment and the incentives on all sides to shape the narrative, figures and conclusions here should be treated as the best available public picture rather than a final verdict.